Chapter 5, Individuality. A quote from Punch and Judy to their audience by Theodore Melnichuk. Our puppet strings are hard to see, so we perceive ourselves as free, convinced that no mere objects could behave in terms of bad and good. To you we mannequins seem less than live because our consciousness is that of dummies made to sit on laps of gods and mouth their wit. Are you our transcendental gods likewise dangled from your rods, and need to show spontaneous charm some higher god's inserted arm? We seem to form a nested set, with each the next one's marionette, who, if you asked him, would insist that he's the last ventriloquist. 5.1 Circular Causality. Whenever we can, we like to explain things in terms of simple cause and effect. We explained the case of Professor Challenger by assuming that my wish to work came first, then work exploited anger's aptitude for fighting sleep. But in real life, the causal relationships between feelings and thoughts are rarely so simple. My desire to work and my annoyance with Challenger were probably so intermingled all along that it is inappropriate to ask which came first, anger or work. Most likely, both agencies exploited one another simultaneously, thus combining both into a single fiendish synthesis that accomplished two goals at once. Work thus got to do its work and thereby injured Challenger. In an academic rivalry, a technical accomplishment can hurt more than a fist. Two goals can support each other. A causes B. John wanted to go home because he felt tired of work. B causes A. John felt tired of work because he wanted to go home. There need be no first cause, since John could start out with both distaste for work and inclination to go home. Then a loop of circular causality ensues, in which each goal gains support from the other until their combined urge becomes irresistible. We're always enmeshed in causal loops. Suppose you had borrowed past your means and later had to borrow more in order to pay the interest on your loan. If you were asked what the difficulty was, it would not be enough to say simply, because I have to pay the interest, or to say only, because I have to pay the principal. Neither alone is the actual cause, and you'd have to explain that you're caught in a loop. We often speak of straightening things out when we're involved in situations that seem too complicated. It seems to me that this metaphor reflects how hard it is to find one's way through a maze that has complicated loops in it. In such a situation, we always try to find a path through it by seeking causal explanations that go in only one direction. There's a good reason for doing this. There are countless different types of networks that contain loops, but all networks that contain no loops are basically the same. Each has the form of a simple chain. Because of this, we can apply the very same types of reasoning to everything we can represent in terms of chains of causes and effects. Whenever we accomplish that, we can proceed from start to end without any need for a novel thought. That's what we mean by straightening out. But frequently, to construct such a path, we have to ignore important interactions and dependencies that run in other directions. 5.2 Unanswerable Questions. And while it shall please thee to continue me in this world, where there is much to be done and little to be known, teach me, by thy Holy Spirit, to withdraw my mind from unprofitable and dangerous inquiries, from difficulties vainly curious and doubts impossible to be solved. Samuel Johnson. When we reflect on anything for long enough, we're likely to end up with what we sometimes call basic questions, ones we can see no way at all to answer. For we have no perfect way to answer even this question. How can one tell when a question has been properly answered? What causes the universe and why? What is the purpose of life? How can you tell which beliefs are true? How can you tell what is good? These questions seem different on the surface, but all of them share one quality that makes them impossible to answer. All of them are circular. You can never find a final cause, since you must always ask one more question. What caused that cause? You can never find any ultimate goal, since you're always obliged to ask, then what purpose does that serve? Whenever you find out why something is good or is true, you still have to ask what makes that reason good and true. No matter what you discover at every step, these kinds of questions will always remain because you have to challenge every answer with, why should I accept that answer? Such circularities can only waste our time by forcing us to repeat over and over and over again what good is good and what God made God. When children keep on asking why, we adults learn to deal with this simply by saying, just because. This may seem obstinate, but it's also a form of self-control, what stops adults from dwelling on such questions endlessly. The answer is that every culture finds special ways to deal with these questions. One way is to brand them with shame and taboo. Another way is to cloak them in awe and mystery. Both methods make those questions undiscussable. Consensus is the simplest way, as with those social styles and trends wherein we accept as true whatever all others do. I think I once heard W.H. Auden say, "We are all here on earth to help others. What I can't figure out is what the others are here for." All human cultures evolve institutions of law, religion, and philosophy, and these institutions both adopt specific answers to circular questions and establish authority schemes to indoctrinate people with those beliefs. One might complain that such establishments substitute dogma for reason and truth, but in exchange they spare whole populations from wasting time in fruitless reason loops. Minds can lead more productive lives when we're working on problems that can be solved. But when thinking keeps returning to its source, it doesn't always mean something's wrong. For circular thinking can lead to growth when it results, at each turn, in deeper and more powerful ideas. Then, because we can communicate, such systems of ideas may even find the means to cross the boundaries of selfish selves, and thus take root in other minds. This way, a language, science, or philosophy can transcend the limitation of each single mind's mortality. Now, we cannot know that any individual is destined for some paradise. Yet, certain religions are oddly right. They manage to achieve their goal of offering an afterlife, if only on their own strange souls. 5.3. The remote control self. When people have no answers to important questions, they often give some anyway. What controls the brain? The mind. What controls the mind? The self. What controls the self? Itself. To help us think about how our minds are connected to the outer world, our culture teaches schemes like this. There's a diagram illustrating a sort of central controller controlling different parts of the mind that control different parts of the body. This diagram depicts our sensory machinery as sending information to the brain, wherein it is projected on some inner mental movie screen. Then, inside that ghostly theatre, a lurking self observes the scene and considers what to do. Finally, that self may act, somehow reversing all those steps, to influence the real world by sending various signals back through yet another family of remote control accessories. This concept simply doesn't work. It cannot help for you to think that inside yourself lies someone else who does your work. This notion of homunculus, a little person inside each self, leads only to a paradox, since then that inner self requires yet another movie screen inside itself on which to project what it has seen, and then to watch that play within a play, we need yet another self inside a self to do the thinking for the last, and then this would all repeat again, as each new self requires yet another one to do its job. The idea of a single central self doesn't explain anything. This is because a thing with no parts provides nothing that we can use as pieces of explanation. Then why do we so often embrace the strange idea that what we do is done by someone else, that is, ourself? Because so much of what our minds do is hidden from the parts of us that are involved with verbal consciousness. 5.4. Personal identity. A quote from Alexander Pope. "Whate'er the passion, knowledge, fame, or pelf, no one will change his neighbour with himself." Why do we accept that paradoxical image of a central self inside the self? Because it serves us well in many spheres of practical life. Here are some reasons to regard a person as a single thing. The physical world. Our bodies act like other objects that take up space. Because of that, we must base our plans and decisions on having a single body. Two people cannot fit where there is room for only one, nor can a person walk through walls or stay aloft without support. Personal privacy. When Mary tells Jack something, she must remember to whom it was told, and she must not assume that every other person knows it too. Also, without the concept of an individual, we could have no sense of responsibility. Mental activity. We often find it hard to think two different thoughts at once, particularly when they're similar, because we get confused when the same agencies are asked to do different jobs at the same time. Why do our mental processes so often seem to us to flow in streams of consciousness? Perhaps because, in order to keep control, we have to simplify how we represent what's happening. Then, when that complicated mental scene is straightened out, it seems as though a single pipeline of ideas were flowing through the mind. These are all compelling reasons why it helps to see ourselves as singletons. Still, each of us must also learn not only that different people have their own identities, but that the same person can entertain different beliefs, plans, and dispositions at the same time. For finding good ideas about psychology, the single agent image has become a grave impediment. To comprehend the human mind is surely one of the hardest tasks any mind can face. The legend of the single self can only divert us from the target of that inquiry. 5.5 Fashion and Style. A quote from Arthur Schnabel. The notes I handle no better than many pianists, but the pauses between the notes, that is where the art resides. Why do we like so many things that seem to us to have no earthly use? We often speak of this with mixtures of defensiveness and pride. Art for art's sake. I find it aesthetically pleasing. I just like it. There's no accounting for it. Why do we take refuge in such vague, defiant declarations? There's no accounting for it sounds like a guilty child who's been told to keep accounts, and I just like it sounds like a person who is hiding reasons too unworthy to admit. However, we often do have sound practical reasons for making choices that have no reasons by themselves but have effects on larger scales. Recognizability. The legs of a chair work equally well if made square or round. Then why do we tend to choose our furniture according to a systematic style or fashion? Because familiar styles make it easier for us to recognize and classify the things we see. Uniformity. If every object in a room were interesting in itself, our furniture might occupy our minds too much. By adopting uniform styles, we protect ourselves from distractions. Predictability. It makes no difference whether a single car drives on the left or on the right, but it makes all the difference when there are many cars. Societies need rules that make no sense for individuals. It can save a lot of mental work if one makes each arbitrary choice the way one did before. The more difficult the decision, the more this policy can save. The following observation by my associate Edward Fredkin seems important enough to deserve a name. Fredkin's paradox. The more equally attractive two alternatives seem, the harder it can be to choose between them. No matter that, to the same degree, the choice can only matter less. No wonder we often can't account for taste. If it depends on hidden rules that we use when ordinary reasons cancel out, I do not mean to say that fashion, style, and art are all the same, only that they often share this strategy of using forms that lie beneath the surface of our thoughts. When should we quit reasoning and take recourse in rules of style? Only when we're fairly sure that further thought will just waste time. Perhaps that's why we often feel such a sense of being free from practicality when we make aesthetic choices. Such decisions might seem more constrained if we were aware of how they're made. And what about those fleeting hints of guilt we sometimes feel for just liking art? Perhaps they're how our minds remind themselves not to abandon thought too recklessly. 5.6 Traits. Isn't it remarkable that words can portray human individuals? You might suppose this should be impossible considering how much there is to say. Then what permits a writer to depict such seemingly real personalities? It is because we all agree that on so many things that are left unsaid. For example, we assume that all the characters are possessed of what we call common sense knowledge, and we also agree on many generalities about what we call human nature. Hostility evokes defensiveness, frustration arouses aggression. We also recognize that individuals have particular qualities and traits of character. Jane is tidy, Mary's timid, Grace is smart. That's not the sort of thing Charles does, it's not his style. Why should traits like these exist? Humanists are prone to boast about how hard it is to grasp the measure of a mind. But let's ask instead, what makes personalities so easy to portray? Why, for example, should any person tend toward a general quality of being neat rather than simply being tidy about some things and messy about others? Why should our personalities show such coherencies? How could it be that a system assembled from a million agencies can be described by short and simple strings of words? Here are some possible reasons. Selectivity. First, we should face the fact that our images of other minds are often falsely clear. We tend to think of another person's personality in terms of that which we can describe and tend to set aside the rest as though it simply weren't there. Style. To escape the effort of making decisions we consider unimportant, we tend to develop policies that become so systematic that they can be discerned from the outside and characterized as personal traits. Predictability. Because it is hard to maintain friendship without trust, we try to conform to the expectations of our friends. Then, to the extent that we frame our images of our associates in terms of traits, we find ourselves teaching ourselves to behave in accord with those same descriptions. Self-reliance. Thus, over time, imagined traits can make themselves actual. For even to carry out our own plans, we must be able to predict what we ourselves are likely to do, and that will become easier the more we simplify ourselves. It's nice to be able to trust our friends, but we need to be able to trust ourselves. How can that be possible when we can't be sure what's in our own heads? One way to accomplish this is by thinking of ourselves in terms of traits, and then proceeding to train ourselves to behave according to those self-images. Still, a personality is merely the surface of a person. What we call traits are only the regularities we manage to perceive. We never really know ourselves because there are so many other processes and policies that never show themselves directly in our behavior, but work behind the scenes. 5.7. Permanent identity. There are causes for all human suffering, and there is a way by which they may be ended, because everything in the world is the result of a vast concurrence of causes and conditions, and everything disappears as these causes and conditions change and pass away. Buddha. What do we signify by words like me, myself, and I? What does a story mean that starts with "in my childhood" when what is that strange possession you which stays the same throughout your life? Are you the same person you were before you learned to read? You scarcely can imagine now how words looked then. Just try to look at these words without reading them. So far as consciousness is concerned, we find it almost impossible to separate the appearances of things from what they've come to mean to us. But if we cannot recollect how things appeared to us before we learn to link new meanings to those things, what makes us think we can recollect how we ourselves appeared to us in previous times? What would you say if someone asked questions like these? Are you the same person now that you once were before you learned to talk? Of course I am. Why, who else would I be? Do you mean that you haven't changed at all? Of course not. I only mean that I'm the same person, the same in some ways, different in others, but still the same me. But how can you be the same as the person you were before you had even learned to remember things? Can you even imagine what that was like? Perhaps I can't, yet still there must have been some continuity. Even if I can't remember it, I surely was that person too. We all experience that sense of changelessness in spite of change, not only for the past, but also for the future too. Consider how you are generous to future self at present self's expense. Today you put some money in the bank in order that sometime later you can take it out. Whenever did that future self do anything so good for you? Is you the body of those memories whose meanings change only slowly? Is it the never-ending side effects of all your previous experience, or is it just whichever of your agents change the least as time and life proceed?